She stood at the edge of a stranger's porch, 4 children clinging to her skirt, and said the words she had rehearsed so many times they no longer hurt her to speak them. I come with 4 children who aren't yours. I know what that means. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. She was already turning to leave. He said, "You counted wrong." That one sentence stopped her cold, and it will stop you too, because what happens next on this frontier will crack something open in your chest that you didn't know was closed. Stay with me until the very end of this story. If it moves you, and I believe it will, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss another story from this family, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The wagon wheel cracked against a frozen rut in the road, and Eliza Barrett didn't even flinch. She had stopped flinching at things a long time ago. The October wind came off the Montana plain like something personal, like it had been sent specifically to remind her that the world had no softness left to offer a 30-year-old widow with 4 children and $17 folded into her boot. She sat straight on the bench seat anyway, spine rigid, chin level, because she had learned early that the moment you let your shoulders drop, the children started asking questions she didn't know how to answer. "Mama." That was Sophie, 6 years old, pressed against Eliza's side with her knees pulled to her chest. "How much further?" "Not far." "You said that an hour ago." "I know I did." Sophie considered this with the grave seriousness only small children can manage. "Are we lost?" "No." Eliza adjusted her grip on the reins. "We are not lost." From the wagon bed behind her, she could hear the other 3 shifting around. Thomas, 9 years old and already convinced he understood the world better than it deserved, was explaining something about cattle to his younger brother Danny, who was 7 and would listen to Thomas explain anything because he simply liked the sound of his older brother's voice. And then there was Evan, 13, quiet, the way frozen ground is quiet, not peaceful, just compressed. Eliza could feel him back there without looking. She always could. The Hawthorne Ranch appeared out of the gray afternoon the way things appear when you've been looking for them too long, all at once, without ceremony. A main house built wider than she'd expected, dark timber and whitewashed plank, with a covered porch running the length of the front. Outbuildings spread behind it, a barn, a corral, a bunkhouse set back from the main structure. The whole property had the look of something that had been built with intention, as though whoever built it had been planning for more than one person. Eliza pulled the wagon to a stop. She sat there for a moment before climbing down, not hesitating. She had learned not to call it hesitating, just taking a breath, just organizing herself. "Stay in the wagon," she told the children. "But Mama, Thomas, stay in the wagon." She smoothed her coat, tucked a loose strand of brown hair back under her hat, and walked toward the front steps. The man who came around the side of the house wasn't what she'd expected from the advertisement. The posting at the general store in Millfield had read, "Seeking housekeeper, Hawthorne Ranch, inquire C. Ashford," nothing else. She had constructed a version of C. Ashford in her head, older, probably, thick around the middle, the kind of rancher who drank his coffee too hot and had opinions about how floors should be swept. The man walking toward her was none of those things. He was tall without making a show of it, broad-shouldered in a worn canvas coat, dark hair gone gray at the temples. He moved the way men move when they've spent years doing physical work and stopped thinking about their bodies as anything other than tools. He had a face that wasn't handsome exactly, but was the kind of face you kept returning to. Strong jaw, a long-healed scar cutting through one eyebrow, eyes that were a complicated shade of brown and did not look away when they found hers. He was, she estimated, mid-30s, maybe 36. She had not expected him to be that young. She recalibrated. "Mr. Ashford?" She extended her hand. "Eliza Barrett. I wrote to you about the housekeeper position." He shook her hand, firm, brief, businesslike. "You made good time. Road from Millfield's rough this time of year." "We managed." His eyes moved past her shoulder, briefly, toward the wagon. He didn't say anything about it. "Come inside," he said. "Coffee's on." She didn't move immediately. This was the part. This was always the part, and she had learned it was better to get it done before anyone wasted any more of their time. "Mr. Ashford, before we go any further, She kept her voice even. She had practiced this too. I have 4 children. They were with me during the journey, and they'll be wherever I am. I understand the posting didn't mention a family, and I understand if that changes your position on the matter. She watched his face. She was good at reading faces now, years of practice. He didn't recoil, didn't recalculate behind his eyes the way men did when the arithmetic stopped working in their favor. He just looked at her steadily. How old? He asked. She blinked. Pardon? The children. How old are they? 13, 9, 7, and 6. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. Then he said, Go ahead and bring them in. It's cold. Eliza felt something tighten in her throat, and she pushed it back down, hard. She did not trust kindness that came this quickly. She had learned that too. Mr. Ashford, she said, and her voice came out lower than she intended. I want to be clear with you about something. I've had this conversation before, with other men, about other positions, and the conclusion is usually the same. What conclusion is that? She looked him straight in the eye. No man wants a woman who comes with 4 children who aren't his. I'm not saying it to be dramatic. I'm saying it because it's been the truth everywhere I've been, and I'd rather you tell me now than after my children have started to settle in somewhere. The wind moved between them. Somewhere behind her, she heard Sophie say something to Danny in a hushed voice. Caleb Ashford looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Sounds like you've been counting wrong. Eliza stared at him. 4 children, he said. You keep saying 4 like that's the problem. The way I see it, that's just... He paused, looked past her toward the wagon where 4 small faces had materialized at the sideboards, despite her instruction to stay seated. A faint expression crossed his face that she couldn't immediately identify. That's just 5 empty places at a table. And I've got a long table. She stood very still. I'm not saying it to be kind, he added, as if he'd heard the thought she hadn't spoken. I'm saying it because it's true. Come inside, Mrs. Barrett. It's cold, and those kids are going to climb out of that wagon with or without your permission. She turned. Danny had, in fact, already climbed down. He was standing in the dirt yard looking at a rooster with the complete absorption of a child who has never seen anything more interesting in his life. The kitchen was warm and smelled of pine smoke and something meaty simmering on the iron stove. Eliza stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment before she stepped inside. It was a large kitchen, larger than any she'd worked in. The table that dominated the center of the room was long, really long, longer than a single man living alone would ever need, with bench seats on both sides and a proper chair at each head. She counted the place settings in her head, an old habit, and stopped. The children were already in motion around her, filling the space the way children fill every space, immediately and completely. Danny was investigating the stove from a safe distance. Sophie had found a rocking chair in the corner and was testing it with the solemnity of someone appraising livestock. Thomas stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, trying to look like he hadn't already cataloged every detail of the room. And Evan stood just inside the doorway, exactly 1 step behind Eliza, not looking at anything in particular. Caleb poured coffee into 2 mugs and set them on the table without asking if she wanted any. Sit down, he said, and it wasn't rude. It just wasn't a question. Eliza sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Caleb sat across from her. He looked at the children without the stiff discomfort most adults adopted around children they didn't know what to do with. He just looked at them, calm and steady, like they were a natural feature of the room. This your first time in Montana? He asked her. Yes. Where are you coming from? Iowa, most recently. Before that, Illinois. Most recently, he repeated, and she could tell he'd heard what that meant. How long you been moving? She took a sip of coffee. It was strong. 3 years. He nodded once. Didn't push. My husband passed 3 years ago, she said anyway, because if this was going to work, if anything was going to work, there was no point constructing a version of herself that would have to be dismantled later. Fever took him in the spring. He was a good man. She paused. The children are his. I didn't ask, Caleb said. I know, I'm telling you anyway. He looked at her over his mug, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not pity, which she would have resented, but something closer to recognition. like he understood the thing underneath the thing she was saying. "The position is straightforward," he said, setting down his mug. "Cooking, cleaning, managing the household. I've got 2 ranch hands, Hector and Pete. They eat here most nights. I'm usually up before sunrise, and I don't expect conversation at that hour." "That's fine. There's a room at the back of the house, large enough for a family bed and some privacy. It's not fancy." "I'm not looking for fancy. There's a bunkhouse if the boy—" He glanced toward Evan, who was still standing by the door with that compressed stillness. "If he'd rather have his own space—" Evan said nothing. "He stays with us," Eliza said quietly. Caleb nodded. "All right." She looked at him, this man who had not flinched and had not calculated and had offered her coffee without asking, and had a table in his kitchen that was built for more people than he had. She looked at him, and she felt the particular wariness that came from wanting very badly to believe something and knowing from experience exactly how wanting things tended to work out. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "I want this to be clear between us. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I'll work hard. But I've had kindness offered to me before that turned into something else once reality set in. I don't say that to be ungrateful. I say it so we both understand where we stand." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Fair enough. All I ask is the same from you." She looked at him. "That if it gets to be too much," he said, "you tell me. You don't just disappear in the night." Something moved across his face, something old and carefully contained. "I don't do well with people disappearing." It was an odd thing to say. She didn't know what to do with it. "I wouldn't do that," she said. "I've got 4 children. I can't afford to disappear." The edge of his mouth shifted. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood. "You keep saying 4, he said. She stared at him. He picked up his mug and rose from the table. "Sophie," he said, and the little girl in the rocking chair looked up immediately, startled that he knew her name, though Eliza had introduced them all at the door. "That rocker belonged to my grandmother. She'd be pleased somebody was using it." Sophie blinked at him with wide, dark eyes. "It's a good rocker," she said finally, with complete gravity. "It is," he agreed. Eliza watched him move to the stove and refill his mug, watched the way Danny immediately appeared at his elbow to study the process with the worshipful attention of a 7-year-old who has decided, inside 30 seconds, that a person is worth following. She watched Caleb glance down at him without breaking stride, without making a production of it, and simply say, "You can help me bring in the wood later if you want." Danny said yes before the sentence was finished. Eliza looked away. She looked at the long table and the empty chairs, and the fire in the iron stove, and the window showing the gray Montana afternoon pressing against the glass, and she felt something in her chest that she could not immediately name because she had not felt it in a very long time. She did not trust it. She was not going to trust it. But she sat there with both hands around her coffee and the warmth of that kitchen settling around her children, and she thought, one day. We'll stay one day and see. From the doorway, Evan watched his mother's face, and he did not think what she thought. He thought what he always thought, what experience had taught him to think, that the kindness of strangers had a shelf life, that men made calculations they didn't announce, and that the only question was never if, but when. He watched Caleb Ashford move through his own kitchen with an ease that looked like permanence. He didn't trust permanence, not anymore. He leaned against the door frame and crossed his arms and waited for the world to confirm what he already knew. Outside, the October wind scraped along the eaves of the Hawthorne Ranch like a warning. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, Eliza Barrett did not feel cold. She didn't know what to do with that either. The first week was the hardest, the way first weeks always are when you're trying to figure out the shape of a life that doesn't belong to you yet. Eliza was up before sunrise every morning, which meant she was up before Caleb, which she considered a small but important victory. She needed that hour before the house woke up. She needed to be standing at that stove with her hands doing something useful before anyone else appeared, because usefulness was the only currency she fully trusted anymore. She could cook, she could clean, she could manage a household with 4 children in it and still have supper on the table by 6. These were things she knew were true about herself, and she held on to them the way you hold on to a railing in the dark. The kitchen was hers by the end of the second day. She'd reorganized it without asking, then spent half an hour bracing for Caleb to walk in and say something about it. He walked in, looked around once, poured his coffee, and said, "The flower used to be on the top shelf, hard to reach." "I put it at counter level," she said, waiting. "Good," he said, and walked out to the barn. That was the whole conversation. She stood there for a moment holding a dish towel, not entirely sure what to do with an argument that hadn't happened. The children, predictably, had no such adjustment period. Danny attached himself to Caleb with the single-minded devotion of a dog who has chosen his person and sees no reason to revisit the decision. By the third morning, he was already waiting at the back door in his coat and boots when Caleb came in from checking the livestock, ready to follow him wherever the day required. Caleb didn't make a fuss about it. He just handed Danny a smaller pair of gloves from a hook by the door. Eliza never figured out where those gloves came from, whether Caleb had children's gloves already or had gotten them specifically, and she was afraid to ask, and said, "Don't get underfoot of the horses." "I won't," Danny said, earnest as a preacher. He got underfoot of the horses twice that first week. Caleb extracted him both times without apparent irritation, just a hand on the back of Danny's collar and a firm repositioning, the way you'd move a friendly obstacle out of a doorway. Sophie was more complicated. She was 6, which meant she had opinions about everything, strong ones, and she expressed them constantly and without embarrassment. She told Caleb on the 4th day that his barn smelled bad. He said that was because it was a barn. She said her grandmother's barn in Illinois hadn't smelled like that. He said her grandmother's barn must have had better-mannered horses. Sophie considered this seriously for a moment and then said, "Probably," and moved on. Thomas stayed quiet and watchful, the way 9-year-olds do when they're trying to figure out the rules of a new place before they commit to anything. He did his chores, stayed out of the way, and watched Caleb from a careful distance, with the assessing eyes of a kid who had learned to read adults for what they actually were rather than what they said they were. Every once in a while, Eliza would catch Thomas watching Caleb with a look she recognized, the look of someone reluctantly updating their understanding of something. She said nothing about it to Thomas. She understood it completely. And Evan stayed exactly where he'd been since the first night, at the edges of things, close enough to observe, far enough to maintain the option of disbelief. He helped with the chores because Eliza asked him to, and because he wasn't lazy, not even a little. He split wood with a focused intensity that Caleb's ranch hand Hector said reminded him of a man working off a debt. He fed the chickens without being asked twice. He fixed a broken hinge on the chicken coop gate without being asked at all, just found the tools in the barn and did it because it needed doing. But whenever Caleb tried to engage him, directly, specifically, the way you have to with a boy who is building a wall, Evan would give short answers and find somewhere else to be. "He'll come around," Hector told Caleb one afternoon, leaning on the corral fence. "Maybe," Caleb said. "Boy that age, lost his father, moved around 3 years. Hector shrugged. "He ain't broken. He's careful." "I know what he is." Hector glanced at him sideways. "You sure? Because you keep trying to talk to him like he's 8. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What would you suggest?" "Stop talking to him," Hector said simply. "Work next to him. Don't say nothing. See what happens." Caleb looked at the corral. "That's your advice. Has it ever not worked on you?" Caleb said nothing, which was its own answer. 1. The second week, the weather turned cold in a way that meant business. Not the cold of October settling in, but the cold of November announcing itself early, the kind that makes ranchers check their firewood supply twice and their roof twice more. Caleb spent 3 days reinforcing the barn, and on the second of those days, without any particular planning, Evan appeared beside him and picked up the other end of the board he was wrestling with. Caleb didn't say thank you. He just adjusted his grip and nodded, and they worked the board into place together. They worked in silence for about 40 minutes. Then Evan said, without looking up from the nail he was setting, "This barn's old." 18 years, Caleb said. "You build it?" "My father started it. I finished it." Evan drove the nail in. "Where's your father?" "Gone. 12 years ago." Evan said nothing for a moment. Then, "Mine's gone 3 years." "I know," Caleb said. They went back to working, But it was a different kind of silence than before. Something had been moved slightly in the space between them. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was declared. It was just two people who had lost something standing in a cold barn doing something useful with their hands. Eliza saw them from the kitchen window. She didn't move away from it for a long time. She told herself she wasn't reading into it. She was very firm with herself about that. She was less firm with herself about other things. The long table, for instance. She had noticed it the first day and filed it away as an oddity. A single man with a table that could seat 10, minimum. But as the days passed and she set that table for 7 people every night, she began to wonder about it. The wood was old but well kept. Someone had sanded it repeatedly over the years. There were small nicks and scars along the surface, the kind of marks a table accumulates over decades of use. Except this table had a quality to the nicks that was different. Not the chaos of a family's accumulated history, but something more like the marks of waiting. A table that had been set and reset and cared for and never quite filled. She mentioned it once, carefully, to Hector, who had been at the ranch longer than anyone. Hector was quiet for a moment, spooning stew into his bowl. Then he said, "Mr. Ashford had a wife. Long time ago." Eliza waited. "Margaret," Hector said. "Good woman. She passed before they ever—" He stopped, adjusted. "Before they had a family. The house was built for a family that never happened." He picked up his bread. He never changed anything, never moved to a smaller place, just kept it all exactly like it was and figured he'd work until work was all there was. Eliza looked at the table. She looked at the empty chairs that weren't empty anymore. Sophie on her left, Danny's booster arrangement of folded blankets on her right, Thomas and Evan down the bench, Hector and Pete at the far end, Caleb at the head. She looked at Caleb, who was cutting his meat and listening to Danny explain something with animated and largely inaccurate detail about how horses slept. She looked away before he caught her looking. The trouble started in the 3rd week, though it didn't announce itself as trouble. It came in the form of Mrs. Cordelia Hames, who drove out from Millfield in a very clean wagon on a Tuesday afternoon with a covered dish and a smile that was performing warmth without quite feeling it. Cordelia Hames was 40, a widow herself, well established in Millfield, and had apparently been of the considered opinion for some time that Caleb Ashford's ranch and Caleb Ashford himself were both underutilized resources in need of proper management. She came with apple cake and cheerful conversation, and she sat in Caleb's parlor and made a point of looking around at the house with an expression that suggested she was mentally rearranging it. Eliza served the coffee. She served it correctly and without expression and excused herself immediately. Sophie did not excuse herself. Sophie materialized in the parlor doorway approximately 90 seconds after Eliza left and stood there staring at Cordelia Hames with the unflinching assessment of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude. "Who are you?" Sophie asked. "I'm Mrs. Hames, sweetheart. I'm a friend of Mr. Ashford's." "We live here now," Sophie said. A small silence. "Yes," Cordelia said carefully. "So I heard. Me and Thomas and Danny and Evan and Mama." Sophie held up fingers. "That's 5. "That's quite a few," Cordelia said, and the warmth in her voice had acquired a certain edge. Sophie looked at her with ancient, unblinking eyes. "Mr. Ashford likes us," she said simply, and turned and walked away. Eliza, who had heard this from the hallway, pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes briefly. She felt something she could not entirely justify. Not quite pride, not quite relief. Something in the vicinity of both. She went back to the kitchen and cut the bread she'd been planning to cut, and told herself very firmly that Cordelia Hames was none of her business. Caleb came into the kitchen after Cordelia left, looking mildly tired in the way people look when they've been polite for longer than they wanted to be. "Mrs. Hames seemed lovely," Eliza said, which was not entirely true, but was the thing you said. "She's persistent," Caleb said, which was specific in a way that told her everything. She kept cutting the bread. "She has opinions about the ranch," he added. "I imagine she does. And about the current household arrangements." Eliza set the knife down. She turned around. "Mr. Ashford, if this situation creates complications for you with people in town, I want you to tell me. I meant what I said the first day. I don't want to be a problem you didn't sign up for." He looked at her with that direct, unhurried gaze that she still hadn't entirely gotten used to. Do you think I'm telling you this because I want you to leave? She held his eyes. I don't know why you're telling me. Because you were in the hallway, he said, and I thought you should know it didn't amount to anything. She stared at him. You're not a problem, Mrs. Barrett. He picked up the bread she'd just cut, took a piece, and walked back out. Supper smells good, he said over his shoulder, and that was the end of it. She stood there for a moment after he left, feeling warmth in her face that she attributed to the stove. Sophie's talent appeared on a Thursday, which seemed like an unremarkable day for something like that to happen. She had been using whatever she could find since they'd arrived. The backs of envelopes, the margins of old newspapers, once the sight of a flour sack that Eliza had been moderately upset about. She drew everything. Horses, chickens, the barn, Danny's face, her own hands. She drew the way some kids talk constantly and without effort, like it was just how she processed the world. Caleb noticed. Eliza wasn't sure when exactly, but she knew he noticed because one evening he came back from Millfield and set a small bundle on the kitchen table without ceremony. A sketchbook, proper and bound, and a set of drawing pencils in a cloth roll, the kind an actual artist would use. He said nothing about it. He just set it down and said supper was smelling good again, the same thing he said every evening, and went to wash up. Sophie found the bundle. The noise she made was not a word. It was the sound a 6-year-old makes when something exceeds the available vocabulary for happiness. She clutched the sketchbook to her chest and looked around the room with enormous eyes, as if she needed a witness for the realness of it. Mr. Ashford left that for you, Thomas told her, in the flat tone of someone trying very hard not to be affected by something that is affecting him. Sophie took the sketchbook and the pencils and sat at the kitchen table and opened to the first page with the reverence of someone beginning something they somehow understand is important. She drew for 2 hours that evening, barely touching her supper, and at the end she tore out the page, carefully, along the seam, and went and knocked on the door of Caleb's study. Eliza heard her knock, heard the door open, held her breath. Sophie said, I drew you. A pause. Caleb's voice, quieter than usual. Can I see? Another pause, longer. Then Caleb said, Sophie, that's real good. Do you really think so? I know so. Who taught you to draw like that? Nobody, Sophie said with the complete honesty of a child. I just do it. Well, a pause. You should keep doing it. Sophie's footsteps came back down the hall, and Eliza listened to them and did not trust herself to say anything when her daughter appeared in the kitchen doorway with glowing eyes. She just said, Come finish your supper. Sophie sat down and picked up her fork and said quietly, mostly to herself, He put it on his desk. I saw him. Eliza looked at her plate. Thomas, across the table, looked at his plate too. Neither of them said a word. But Danny's integration was easier, in the way of things that don't require thought. He was 7, and Caleb had given him a job, loose and informal, more of a standing invitation than an assignment, to help with the morning feeding. Danny took it with the seriousness of a military commission. He was up every morning before Eliza, which was a thing that had never happened before in his entire living memory, already pulling on his second boot when she came down the hall. You'll slow him down, Eliza said, more than once. I'm helpful, Danny said, with absolute conviction, and went out the door. She watched from the window. Caleb never sent him away, never told him to wait somewhere while the real work got done. He handed Danny the smaller tasks, filling water troughs, scattering feed, checking gate latches. And Danny completed them with the fierce concentration of someone who has decided his entire worth is bound up in doing this correctly. When he got something wrong, Caleb showed him again, without impatience, without the particular cruelty of making a child feel stupid. Once, she heard Danny say, I'm sorry, I did it wrong again. And Caleb said, You did it wrong once, now you know the right way. Danny was quiet for a second. Then, How do you not get mad? I get mad, Caleb said, just not at things that are still learning. Eliza stepped back from the window. She was not going to do this. She was not going to stand at windows watching a man be decent to her children and turn it into something it hadn't been offered as. That was how you ended up in trouble. That was how you ended up in a situation where your children got attached, and then something fell apart, and you had to pack everything again and explain to 4 people who had already lost enough that they were losing something else. She went back to the stove. She was careful. She was always careful. Sit. The evenings were the hardest to be careful in. Supper was loud, which still surprised her. 7 people at a table that long, with Danny's running commentary, and Sophie's periodic announcements, and even Thomas starting to offer opinions on ranch matters he'd been quietly absorbing all day. It was louder than any kitchen she'd sat in since Iowa, since before. Hector and Pete were easy company, the kind of men who spoke when they had something to say and were comfortable enough in silence otherwise. Caleb presided over it, all the way he did everything, without performing it, just present, occasionally contributing a dry observation that Thomas particularly seemed to receive as high honor. After supper, the children did their schoolwork at the long table while Eliza cleaned up. Caleb sometimes sat at the far end of the table with his account books while this happened, and sometimes he didn't. But when he did, there was something about the arrangement, the lamplight, the scratch of pencils, the muffled sound of wind at the walls, that felt so settled and so dangerously like something she'd given up on wanting that Eliza had to actively look at something ordinary to remind herself it was fragile. One night she looked up from the dishes and saw Caleb leaning over the table next to Thomas, looking at something in Thomas's arithmetic book. Thomas was explaining something, pointing at the page. Caleb was nodding and said something she couldn't hear, and Thomas laughed. Actually laughed. The loose, easy laugh of a kid who has lowered his guard without deciding to, and Eliza turned back to the dishes before either of them could look up and catch her watching. Her hands were shaking a little, not from cold. She gripped the edge of the sink and breathed, and gave herself the same warning she'd given herself every night for 3 weeks in this kitchen that smelled of pine smoke and was warmer than any place she'd been in 3 years. Don't, she thought. You know better than this. You know exactly how this goes. Across the room, one of her children laughed again. She closed her eyes. The ranch was quiet beyond the windows. The November cold pressed against the glass, and Evan sat at the far end of the bench with his school book open in front of him, not reading it, watching Caleb with Thomas from a careful distance, with an expression on his face that he would have denied immediately if anyone had mentioned it. It looked, just briefly, like longing. Then it closed again, like a shutter, like he'd caught himself. He looked back down at his book. Outside, the first real snow of the season had started to fall, slow and indifferent and heavy, with the kind of weight that doesn't stop until it's done something permanent. None of them saw it yet. The snow that had started falling at the end of November didn't stop being serious about itself until mid-December, and by then the Hawthorne Ranch had settled into a winter rhythm that felt uncomfortably like something permanent. Eliza had stopped arguing with herself about the kitchen. She had stopped telling herself that the warmth she felt sitting at that long table every evening was just gratitude for shelter, nothing more complicated than that. She hadn't resolved anything. She was too honest with herself for false resolution. She had simply gotten tired of the argument. The feelings were there. She wasn't going to act on them. That was the arrangement she'd made with herself, and she considered it workable. What she had not made any workable arrangement about was Evan. He was getting worse. Not in any way she could point to directly, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone watching from the outside. He did his work. He was polite. He ate his supper and completed his schoolwork and responded when spoken to. But Eliza knew her son the way you know a place you've lived in a long time, by its sounds, by what those sounds meant, by the specific quality of the silences between them. And the silence coming off Evan in those December weeks had a different texture than before. Tighter, more deliberate. He was working something out in his head. She knew the signs. She'd seen it before, in the months after his father died, when he'd gone quiet in a particular way, and then announced one morning, age 10, that he was the man of the family now and nobody had better tell him otherwise. She hadn't known whether to be proud of him or to sit down and cry. She'd done neither. She'd said, "You're 13, Evan." And he'd said, 10. "I'm 10. And she'd said, "I know how old you are." And that had been the end of the conversation, though not the end of the thing underneath it. He was working something out. She just didn't know what. She should have pushed harder. She knew that later. She should have sat him down and made him talk to her the way she'd made him talk when he was younger, before he'd figured out that silence was armor. But December was relentless with its demands. Firewood and frozen water troughs, and the older ranch hand Pete developing a cough that kept everyone on edge. And she told herself there would be time. There was always going to be time. That was the lie she told herself. There wasn't time. There never is. It was a Tuesday. Eliza remembered it as a Tuesday because she'd spent the morning on laundry, which she always did on Tuesdays. And the washtubs in the utility room had made the whole side of the house smell like lye soap for most of the day. She remembered thinking around mid-afternoon that she should check on Evan, who had asked to be excused from afternoon chores with a headache. She'd put her hand to his forehead, no fever, and told him to rest. She got busy. Pete's cough was getting worse, and she spent an hour making a poultice and arguing with Pete about whether he needed it. He did not believe he needed it, and she did not care what he believed. And by the time she'd won that argument and gotten supper started, it was past 5 o'clock and the light was already gone. She called the children in at 5:30. Danny came first, snow on his boots. Sophie behind him, a new drawing tucked under her arm. Thomas, who'd been helping Hector check fence posts, came through the back door knocking snow off his hat. She counted them in. It was habit, the way breathing was habit. She got to 3. She went down the hall to the room at the back. The door was open. The bed was made, too neatly, the way a person makes a bed when they want it to look like they've been lying in it rather than have someone know they haven't been for a while. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. His good pair of boots. The ones she'd resoled in September. On the small table beside the bed, folded once, was a piece of paper. She picked it up. Her hands were steady. She made them be steady. Mama, don't worry. I'm not running away. I'm just going, so there's one less. It'll be easier. He'll keep you all. I know he will if I'm not there making it complicated. You don't have to look for me. E. She read it twice. The second time her hands weren't as steady. She walked back down the hall, and her face must have been something because Thomas took one look at her and said, Mama, what? Where's Evan? She kept her voice even. When did you last see him? This morning, Thomas's voice dropped. What happened? Thomas, this morning, where... He was in the barn when I left at noon. Mama, what? She was already moving. She grabbed her coat from the hook. Thomas was on his feet. You stay with Sophie and Danny, she said. I'm not staying. Thomas. She turned and looked at him, and whatever was on her face made him stop. Please, keep your brother and sister inside, please. He sat back down. He looked young suddenly, younger than 9, and she hated that. Hated that she kept having to show her children the face she wore when things were going wrong. She went out the back door into the dark and the cold. Caleb was in the barn with Hector, working on a piece of tack by lamplight. He looked up when she pushed the door open, took one look at her face and said, What happened? Evan's gone. She showed him the note. She watched him read it. She watched his expression because she always watched people's expressions now, because she needed to know what was real and what was performance. What crossed his face was not inconvenience. It was not the careful recalculation of a man adding up what this situation was going to cost him. It was something cleaner and harder than that. He handed the note back to her. How long ago? I don't know. He was in the barn at noon, Thomas says. Caleb looked at Hector. 5 hours. Maybe more. Temperature's dropping, Hector said quietly. He wasn't minimizing it. He was stating a fact that they all needed to be working with. What direction would he go? Caleb said to Eliza. Think. Is there anywhere he's mentioned wanting to see? Anything he hasn't talked to me. Her voice cracked on the last word and she pressed it flat. He doesn't talk to me about things like this. He hasn't since his father... She stopped. He'd go toward town. He knows Millfield. He'd think he could... It's 8 miles. I know how far it is. Caleb was already moving. He pulled his heavy coat off the peg, his gloves, his hat. He said to Hector, Saddle Scout. Take Pete. Pete's sick. He was checking the lantern oil. I'll take the north road toward town, cut across Ridley's field at the bend. It's the shortest walking route. Caleb. Hector's voice had a different tone now. Wind's coming. Temperature's already 10 below. I know what the temperature is. He picked up the lantern. He looked at Eliza. Go back inside with the others. Keep them calm. I'll find him. I should come. Eliza. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She registered it somewhere under everything else. You're the only thing standing between those three children in there and panic. They need you inside. I'll find him. She wanted to argue. She understood the argument she would have made, that Evan was her son and she should be the one. But she also understood, with the specific clarity that fear sometimes burns into you, that he was right. Thomas could hold himself together. Danny couldn't. Sophie definitely couldn't, and she was the only anchor any of them had. He's got his good boots, she said, his heavy coat. He took extra socks from the drawer, I could tell. Something moved in Caleb's face, a brief expression that she understood, that the boy had prepared, which meant he'd been thinking about this for a while, which meant it wasn't impulse. He nodded once. He went out the barn door, and she listened to him talk to Scout in a low voice while Hector saddled the horse, listened to the creak and shift of Scout's weight, and then hoofbeats moving away into the dark and the cold. She walked back to the house. Thomas met her at the door. "He'll find him," she said. Thomas looked at her with those careful eyes. "Do you believe that?" She held his gaze. "Yes." And the thing was, she did. She didn't fully understand why she did, but she did, and she let herself have that, because right now it was the only solid thing in reach. Caleb had found Evan's tracks before he reached the first mile marker, which was partly luck and partly the fact that a 13-year-old boy walking alone in 6 inches of snow does not leave a subtle trail. He followed them off the north road about a quarter-mile out, where Evan had veered east, apparently deciding to cut across the open field rather than stay on the road, which would have been a reasonable decision in daylight. In the dark, in dropping temperatures, with the wind picking up from the northwest, it was the kind of decision that got people killed on the Montana plain and had been doing so for 100 years. Caleb pushed Scout forward, holding the lantern out to his left to keep the track visible. The boy had been moving fast at first. The strides were long and determined, the prints deep. Then they shortened. Then they began to drag at the toe. Cold worked on you like that. First it took your speed, then your judgment, then your will. He found Evan in the hollow where Ridley's fence cut along the low ground, where the wind had been channeling all day and the temperature was lower than anywhere else on the plain. The boy was sitting with his back against a fence post, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around himself. His head was down. Caleb's chest did something painful. He swung down from Scout and crossed the snow and crouched in front of him, and Evan's head came up. Slowly, too slowly, and his eyes found Caleb's face. His lips were the wrong color. His eyelashes had frost on them. "I didn't—" Evan's voice came out wrong, thick and slurred at the edges. "I didn't want you to come." "I know," Caleb said. He was already pulling the blanket from behind the saddle. "I came anyway." "You should. I'm not your— You don't have to—" "Evan." Caleb wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and pulled it tight, and then put both his hands on the sides of the boy's face, and Evan went very still, like he'd been braced for something and didn't know what to do with this instead. "Stop talking and let your body warm up. We'll talk later." "I was trying to make it easier," Evan said, and his voice broke badly on the last word. I've been watching, and I know how it works. I've seen it before. Men count everything. They count us, and it's too many, and they go. I've seen it. I've seen it happen, and I thought if there was one less—" He stopped, swallowed. His throat worked hard. "I thought if I wasn't there, you'd keep them. You'd keep Mama and the little ones. I know you would. But me, I'm the one I take up space and I don't. I'm not easy. I know I'm not. And I thought, Evan." The boy stopped. Caleb looked at him. He held his gaze steady the way you have to with a frightened animal, the way you have to with anything that has been hurt enough times that stillness reads as threat. He kept his hands where they were, one on each side of that cold, frostbitten face. "You have it backward," Caleb said. Evan stared at him. "You think you're the problem in this situation. I need you to hear me, because I'm only going to say it once out here in the cold, and you're going to remember it." He paused, making sure Evan was with him. "You are not the extra one. You are not the difficult one. You are the oldest. You're the one who has been carrying your family for 3 years while your mother carried all of you, and neither of you said a word about how heavy it was. He paused. That's not a burden to me. That's exactly the kind of person I've been missing at this ranch. Evan's eyes were wet. He was fighting it hard, the way 13-year-old boys fight it. Like the whole argument about who they are might be lost if one tear gets through. You don't know me, Evan said, but the conviction had gone out of it. I know you fixed that chicken coop gate on your own in the second week because it needed doing, and you didn't want to wait to be asked. Caleb's voice stayed level. I know you've been watching your mother every single day making sure she's all right. I know how to be quiet when quiet is what someone needs, and that's not a small thing. That's not nothing. He let his hands drop from the boy's face, but he stayed crouched right there in front of him. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see the eldest son I always wanted. That's what I see. And I'm not saying that to make you feel better on a cold night. I'm saying it because it is just exactly true. The tear got through. Evan turned his face away fast, jaw clenched, and Caleb let him have that. He didn't make a thing of it. He stood up, looped Scout's reins over the fence post, and pulled out his canteen. The inside of it was still lukewarm from where it had rested against the saddle blanket, and crouched back down. Drink some of this, he said. Evan took it with shaking hands and drank. He was shaking badly now, which was actually better than before because shaking meant his body was working on itself again. Can you stand? Evan tried. His legs were stiff and uncertain, and he started to go sideways and grabbed the fence post and then Caleb's arm, and Caleb held him steady without comment until he had his feet properly under him. You're going to ride, Caleb said. I'll lead Scout. You don't have to. Evan, a firm look. Get on the horse. A long moment. Then, quietly, yes, sir. He helped the boy up into the saddle, gave him both reins to hold and something to do with his hands, and then wrapped the second blanket from the saddlebag. He'd brought two, which meant he'd thought about this before he left the barn, around Evan's legs and tucked it under him as well as he could manage. Then he took Scout's bridle and started walking back toward the north road, into the wind. They were quiet for most of the walk back. The wind was bad, but it was at an angle, not straight into their faces, and the lantern held. Caleb didn't push conversation. He'd said what needed saying. The rest of it would come in time or it wouldn't, and there was no forcing it. About halfway back to the road, Evan said, How did you find me so fast? Your tracks, Caleb said. You've got a long stride for your age. You cut east off the road, which is the way I would have gone. Evan was quiet. Then, my dad taught me to read land like that, looking at the shortest line. Caleb glanced back at him over his shoulder. Your dad taught you well. Something shifted in Evan's face, in the lamplight, that was complicated and quiet and probably private, and Caleb looked back to the road. Was he a good man? Caleb asked. He wasn't sure why he asked. It just seemed like the right thing, out here in the dark, to let the boy talk about his father if he wanted to. Yeah, Evan said. The simplicity of it said everything. He was a good man. He got sick. I know. Mama doesn't talk about him. She doesn't want us to be sad. That sounds like your mother. A pause. Do you think that's wrong, not talking about him? Caleb considered it honestly. I think people carry grief however they can manage it. Your mother's been carrying a lot. She did what she could. I still talk to him, Evan said quietly, like a confession. In my head, when things are hard. Nothing wrong with that. You think? I do the same thing, Caleb said. With my father. He heard Evan shift in the saddle above him, processing that. You said in the barn, Evan said after a while, that your father died 12 years ago. He did. Did it get easier? Caleb walked for a moment without answering because it was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. Different, he said finally. Not easier exactly. Different. The missing doesn't go away. You just build more around it so it's not the only thing there anymore. The lights of the ranch appeared in the distance, yellow squares of window glow against the dark. Evan saw them and let out a breath that was visible in the cold air, a long, slow breath that he'd probably been holding in different ways for months. She's going to be upset, he said. She's going to be grateful, Caleb said. She's allowed to be both. She's going to cry. Probably. She hates crying in front of us. I know she does. Caleb kept walking, Scout's breath steaming beside his shoulder. Let her do it anyway. She's earned it. Evan was quiet for the last stretch of road. When they reached the yard and the barn light fell across them, the back door opened immediately. She must have been watching from the window. And Eliza came out without a coat, without thinking about herself at all, across the snow in her house shoes, and Caleb heard the small, involuntary sound she made when she saw Evan on the horse, alive and upright and looking at her. She reached up and Evan half fell, half climbed down into her arms, and she held on to him with her whole body, her face against the side of his head, her eyes closed tight. Evan held on too. He tried not to. He was 13 and had been holding himself apart from comfort for 3 years, and his instinct was still to stay separate. But he was also cold, and he was also exhausted, and he was also 13, and his mother's arms were around him, and whatever walls were left gave way all at once, quietly, like ice at the edge of a thaw. He pressed his face against her shoulder and shook. She held him and didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Caleb stood back with Scout's reins and looked at them. This woman in her house shoes in the snow, holding her son with everything she had, and felt something in his own chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time, something he had trained himself out of feeling because it was dangerous to feel things you couldn't have. It moved through him anyway, unwilling to be managed. Hector appeared at the barn door. He looked at Caleb. His eyes moved to Eliza and Evan. He said nothing, just nodded once, slowly, and Caleb nodded back. After a long moment, Eliza raised her head. She looked at Caleb over Evan's shoulder. The lamplight was on her face, and her eyes were wet, and she didn't try to hide it, which he knew cost her something. She said, without words, what she couldn't say out loud yet. He received it, without words, the same way. Then Evan lifted his head and looked at Caleb. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his face was raw from wind and cold and crying, and he had never in his life looked more like a boy who was trying very hard to be a man before he was ready. And Caleb knew that face from the inside out. "Thank you," Evan said. His voice was rough. "For coming out." "Of course," Caleb said, like it was obvious, like there had never been another option, which, for him, there hadn't. He brought Scout into the barn. He took his time unsaddling her, rubbing her down, making sure she was warm and fed. He did it slowly, the way you do things when you need to give yourself a moment before you go back into the light. When he finally came into the kitchen, Evan was at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug. Sophie was pressed against his side, not saying anything for once, just there. Danny was on his other side. Thomas sat across from him, and the two of them weren't talking, just making eye contact in the particular way of brothers who have been scared and are relieved and don't need to narrate it. Eliza was at the stove. Her back was to the room. Caleb hung his coat, pulled off his boots. He sat down at the head of the table and someone, he thought it was Thomas, slid the coffee pot toward him without being asked. He poured himself a cup. The kitchen was warm and smelled of pine smoke and the leftover something from supper, and outside the wind was loud against the walls. Inside it was not quiet exactly. It was full of breath and proximity and the small sounds of 5 people who have been frightened coming slowly back to themselves. After a while, Sophie looked up from Evan's shoulder and looked at Caleb with her enormous, serious eyes. "You found him," she said, with a certainty that suggested she had never doubted it. Caleb looked at her. "I found him," he said. Sophie nodded. Like this was what she had expected. Like this was, in fact, the only outcome she had been prepared to accept. She put her head back down against her brother's arm. Eliza turned from the stove then, finally, and set a plate of something warm in front of Caleb without looking directly at him. Her jaw was set and her eyes were dry now, and her hands were steady. But as she pulled her hand back from the table, her fingers brushed his, briefly, not quite by accident. Neither of them looked up. Neither of them said a word about it. Outside, the Montana wind drove snow hard against the windows of the Hawthorne Ranch, and for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, nobody inside that house felt it. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay in the dark listening to the breathing of her children, all 4 of them in the back room, Sophie curled against Evan's side like she'd appointed herself his personal anchor. Danny sprawled at the foot of the bed with the total physical abandon of a child who has processed his fear and moved on completely. And she stared at the ceiling and let the night do what it was going to do. Her fingers still felt the brief warmth of Caleb's hand under hers. She told herself it was accidental. She had been telling herself that for 3 hours, and she was getting less convincing each time. The thing she kept coming back to was not the touch itself, but the fact that she hadn't pulled away. In 3 years of being careful, carefully grateful, carefully distant, carefully managing every interaction with every person who had anything to offer her children, she had developed an instinct for pulling away. It had kept them safe. It had kept her sane. She pulled away from things before they could be taken from her because the sequence she'd learned was always the same. Warmth, then reality, then the look on a man's face when he recalculated. She knew that sequence so well she could feel it coming from a mile off, and her response was always the same. She pulled away first. She hadn't pulled away. She rolled onto her side and looked at the wall and made herself be honest, which was the only thing she knew how to do with herself in the dark. She had feelings for Caleb Ashford. Not complicated, confused feelings. Clear ones. The kind that had been building so gradually and so consistently that she'd been able to pretend for weeks they weren't there, and now, after tonight, could not pretend any longer. She respected him. She trusted him. And that was the thing that frightened her most, because she had not trusted anyone in 3 years, not really, not with anything that mattered. And she trusted him with the things that mattered most. She trusted him with her children. She had watched him ride into the dark and the cold after her son without a second thought, and she had known, in some place past argument, that he would come back with Evan. She had known it the way you know the ground will hold you when you step on it. That was not a small thing. That was not a thing you could unfeel once you'd felt it. She pressed her face into the pillow and lay there and let herself have the reality of it, just for the length of that long night, because morning was going to require her to be practical again. Yep. Morning came the way mornings do after nights like that, gray and undramatic, demanding the same things it always demanded. The stove needed feeding, breakfast needed making. Pete's chest still rattled when he breathed, and she needed to check on him. Danny needed his boot resoled where the sole was starting to separate at the toe. Thomas had an arithmetic lesson he'd been avoiding. She was at the stove before anyone else, earlier than usual. She needed the head start. She heard Caleb on the stairs. She knew his step now, the particular way he put his weight down, the slight pause at the third stair from the bottom that she'd learned meant he was adjusting to whatever the day looked like through the front window. And she heard him come into the kitchen and stop. She didn't turn around. She heard him pour his coffee. The silence between them was different than other mornings. It had shape to it. Weight. "How's he doing?" Caleb said behind her. "Sleeping?" She kept stirring. His hands were a little raw from the cold. "I put salve on them. He'll be fine." "Good." The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the early light was coming up gray over the snow. "Caleb." She still didn't turn around. His given name in her mouth felt strange and correct at the same time. "I owe you something." "You don't owe me." "I owe you an explanation." She set the spoon down. She turned around. He was standing at the table with his mug, looking at her with that steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything, and she made herself hold it. "For why I said what I said, the first day, about the children being a burden. I need you to know where that came from, because after last night I think you deserve to understand it, and I should have told you a long time ago." He said nothing. He set his mug down and leaned against the table and waited, which was exactly the right thing, and she wasn't entirely surprised. She pulled out a chair and sat, because this was going to take a while and her legs felt unreliable. "After James died," she said. She cleared her throat. "After James died, I was in Iowa with 4 children and not enough money and a farm that I couldn't run alone. We stayed through the summer because I thought I could manage it, and I couldn't. By fall, I had to sell. Then we were in town, in a boarding house, and I was doing laundry and mending for anyone who'd pay. And it became clear very quickly that," she paused, choosing words, "that what I was, a widow with 4 children, was a category of person that men looked at and calculated. Like a math problem. And the answer they kept getting was that the numbers didn't work. Caleb watched her. There was a man in Millfield, Iowa, not here. She looked at her hands, then back up at him, because she'd promised herself she'd say this straight. His name was Gerald Klein. He was decent enough, or seemed it. He had land, a solid house. He came calling 3 times and was kind to the children. Thomas liked him. That mattered a lot to me, that Thomas liked him, because Thomas doesn't like people easily. She took a breath. He asked me to marry him in March. 2 years after James, I said yes. Caleb was very still. He came to the boarding house a week later to talk about arrangements. He sat across from me at the table, same as you're doing now, and he said, she stopped. Something in her throat tried to stop her, and she pushed past it. He said he'd been thinking. He said he was prepared to take on 2 of the children. He'd been very deliberate about it. He'd thought about which 2 would be easier. He'd actually decided which 2. He said the older ones could probably find work, and that was the thing he actually said. The older ones, meaning Evan, who was 11, and Thomas, who was 7. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that, and immediately aware that being proud of it was its own kind of sadness. And he sat there looking at me like he'd made a reasonable proposal. The kitchen was very quiet. I didn't say anything for a moment, she said. And then I said, I'm sorry. I think I've made a mistake. And I stood up and I showed him to the door, and I went back upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed in that boarding house room, and I looked at my 4 children and I thought, her voice changed just slightly. I thought, I will never do that again. I will never put them in a room with a man who is calculating which ones he can tolerate. So I stopped. I stopped thinking about anything except getting them somewhere safe and fed and together. All 4 of them. Always all 4. She looked at her hands again. They were very still on the table. That's why I said it, she said. The first day. That's why I stood on your porch and said what I said about the children, about being a burden. Because I've learned that if I say it first, if I make them say yes or no before anyone gets attached, then at least... She stopped. Reorganized. At least it's quick. At least the children don't have time to... She stopped again. To trust someone, Caleb said quietly. She looked up at him. Before he shows them what he actually came for, he said. She held his eyes. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his coffee mug, looked at it, set it back down. He had the look of a man deciding something, not about her, but about how much of himself to offer back. And she watched him work through it because she knew that look. She'd felt it herself. I built this house in 1878, he said. She hadn't expected him to start there. I was 24. I'd just bought the land from the man who homesteaded it, and I cleared the north field that first year, and I built the barn, and I built this house. I built it bigger than I needed. He glanced around the kitchen, the same way she sometimes caught herself looking at it. I had a particular picture in my head of what this place was going to be. He paused. Her name was Margaret, he said. I'd known her since we were children. We grew up in the same county, outside of Billings. When I bought this land, she agreed to come out with me, and we were married that fall, and she... Something crossed his face, controlled, and old. She was everything. She was sharp and funny, and she was not afraid of anything, not the cold or the work or the isolation. She liked it out here. She said it felt like the world had been cleaned. He stopped. His jaw moved. She got sick in our second winter. It wasn't supposed to be serious. It turned serious very fast. She was gone before the spring thaw. Eliza was very still. We'd been trying to start a family, he said, flat and simple. We'd been hoping, so when she went, I was 26 years old with this house I'd built for something that hadn't happened yet and now wasn't going to happen. He looked at the table. I didn't change anything. People told me I should sell the house, get something smaller, don't rattle around in all that space. But he stopped. It felt wrong to change it, like admitting that it wasn't going to... He stopped again. Anyway, I just kept working. 10 years of just working. That's what I had. He looked at her then, directly. And then your wagon came up the drive, he said, and you stood on my porch and the first thing you did was try to make me tell you no. The edge of his mouth moved. And I thought, what kind of woman announces her own worst-case scenario before anyone's asked? And then I saw why. I saw those four. He paused. His expression shifted into something that was difficult to look at directly, not because it was painful, but because it was so unguarded. I saw those four kids in the wagon, and I looked at this woman standing in front of me trying to protect them from one more disappointment, and I thought. He stopped himself. What? She said. He looked at her carefully. I thought, this is what I built the table for. The sentence landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Eliza looked at him. She looked at this man who had been alone for 10 years in a house he'd built for a family that grief took from him, who had ridden into a frozen field in the dark to bring her son home, who had given her daughter a sketchbook and her youngest son a pair of small gloves, and never once mentioned either thing again. She felt something happen in her chest that she had been bracing against for weeks. I've been afraid, she said. Her voice was lower than she intended. I've been afraid that I know what you've been afraid of. I don't think you, Eliza. His voice was quiet and certain. You've been afraid that I'd wake up one morning and the arithmetic would stop working and I'd show you the door. That's what you've been afraid of. She held his eyes. Her throat was tight. Yes, but I need you to understand something. He leaned forward slightly, not moving from where he was, just closing the distance between them by a degree. Where you see subtraction, I have only ever seen the opposite. You didn't bring me problems when you drove up that road. You brought 5 people into a house that had been empty for 10 years, and you filled it. His voice stayed level. It was not a speech. It was just a man telling the truth in plain language, and the plainness of it was what got through her. I'm not managing you. I'm not tolerating the children in order to have someone cook my meals. I'm not calculating when to cut my losses. That has never been what this is. She was crying. She hadn't decided to. It just happened, the way it happened when the thing you've been holding your muscles against for a very long time finally gets past them. Quiet. Not dramatic. Just tears running down her face while she sat at the table in the kitchen she'd made her own. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. I'm sorry, she said. I'm not. Don't apologize for that. I don't cry in front of people. I know you don't. He slid the cloth napkin from beside his coffee mug across the table toward her. You can anyway. She took it. She pressed it against her eyes and held it there and breathed, and he didn't say anything, didn't fill the silence with reassurance the way people did when they were uncomfortable with emotion. He just let her have it, which was the right thing, which was what she would have done. When she lowered the napkin, he was still just looking at her. I have been telling myself for 3 years, she said, steadier now, that I don't deserve. She stopped. Tried again. I have been telling myself that wanting things for myself is something I used up. That the only thing I'm supposed to want now is for them to be safe. That wanting anything else is. She couldn't finish it. Selfish, Caleb said. She looked at him. Is that the word you were going to use? She was quiet for a moment. Yes. Who told you that? Nobody told me. Who taught you that? She thought about it. She thought about 3 years of doors closing, 3 years of carrying everything herself, 3 years of saying I come with 4 children, like it was a warning label, like she herself was an inconvenience that happened to come packaged with more inconveniences. Gerald Klein, she said, and then, more quietly, and everyone before him who looked at us and did the math. Caleb nodded slowly. Then they lied to you, he said. Maybe not on purpose. Maybe they just couldn't manage it. But that doesn't make it true. She looked at him for a long time. It's hard to unknow something, she said. I know it is. He said it simply, without pretending it wasn't. But you can start. The light coming through the kitchen window had gone from gray to pale gold, the particular color of a winter morning after a snowstorm, when everything outside is clean and white and cruelly beautiful. Eliza looked at it and felt the specific quality of this moment, its fragility, its realness, the way it balanced on its own edge. I don't know how to do this, she said. I don't know how to be. I haven't been. I stopped knowing how to trust someone with this, with any of this. I'm not sure I remember how. You don't have to remember all at once, he said. What if I get it wrong? Then you get it wrong. He picked up his mug. We figure it out. She looked at him. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, he said. I didn't say it was simple. I said we'd figure it out. He paused. There's a difference. She almost smiled. It felt unfamiliar on her face. That particular kind of almost smile. The one that comes from something real rather than from managing a situation. She hadn't felt it in a long time. From down the hall came the sound of small feet on the floorboards. Danny, almost certainly. Danny was constitutionally unable to sleep past sunrise when there were horses that needed feeding. Eliza straightened. She wiped her face one more time with the napkin, neatly, and set it on the table. She stood up and went back to the stove and picked up the spoon she'd set down 10 minutes ago. Behind her, she heard Caleb stand, heard him take his coat from the hook. Eliza. She looked over her shoulder. For what it's worth, he said, I have never once counted your children. She looked at him. Not as a burden, he said. Not as a number, just as... He paused, searching for it, and she realized he was not a man who made speeches, was not practiced at this, was reaching for something honest and finding it harder to reach than he'd expected. Just as mine, he said finally. If that's... He stopped. If that's all right with you. The word settled somewhere inside her chest and stayed. She turned back to the stove. It's all right, she said. She heard him go out the back door. She heard his boots on the steps, the creak of the barn door a moment later. Danny appeared in the kitchen doorway in his coat and one boot, hopping slightly, wrestling with the second. He looked up at her, then at the empty room, then back at her. Where's Mr. Ashford? Barn, she said. Danny got his boot on. He looked at her face with the uncomplicated perceptiveness of a 7-year-old. Were you crying? I was not, she said. Your eyes are red. I had something in my eye. Danny considered this. Both of them. She pointed at the door. Go help with the horses. He went, satisfied, banging out through the back door. She could hear him calling to Caleb before he'd even crossed the yard. She stood at the stove and let the tears that she was absolutely not crying run down her face one more time, quiet and entirely without drama, and wiped them away with the back of her wrist before anyone else came downstairs. Evan came down last, which she'd expected. He came in slowly, with the careful movements of someone whose body had been through something and whose mind was still working out how to talk about it. His hands were slightly swollen at the knuckles from the cold. He sat down at the table and looked at the plate she set in front of him and didn't eat immediately, which was unlike him. How do you feel? She said. Fine. He picked up his fork. Hands hurt a little. They'll be better in a few days. She poured him coffee, which she normally didn't give him, and set it beside his plate. And he looked at it and then up at her with the slight surprise of someone receiving an unexpected thing. She sat down across from him. They ate in silence for a moment. Then Evan said, without looking up, I'm sorry for the trouble. You're not trouble, she said. I made everyone... Evan. She waited until he looked at her. His face was tired and younger than usual, the way faces get when the armor's been down long enough that they've forgotten to put it back on. I know why you did it. I understand why you did it. That doesn't mean I'm not furious with you, because I am, and we are going to have a longer conversation about it when you're feeling better. She paused. But I understand. He held her eyes. Did he tell you what he said, out there? No. Evan looked back at his plate. He was quiet for a moment. He said I was the eldest son he always wanted. His voice was careful around the words, like he was carrying something breakable. He said it like it was just a fact, like I should have already known. Eliza said nothing. Nobody's ever said anything like that to me, Evan said, since Dad. He pressed his fork against the plate unnecessarily. I didn't know what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. You just let it be true. He looked up at her. Is it, though? Do you think he meant it? She thought about the man who had driven out into a 10 below night without hesitation. The man who had stayed crouched in the snow in front of a frightened boy and said the thing that needed saying with no audience and no performance. She thought about small gloves hanging by the back door and a sketchbook placed on a table without ceremony, and a boy being shown how to do something wrong twice without being made to feel stupid for it. "Yes," she said. "I think he meant every word." Evan was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was part grief and part something else, something newer, something that didn't have a name yet because he hadn't needed the word for it in a long time. "Okay," he said finally, low and private, more to himself than her. "Okay." He picked up his coffee. He drank it. She watched her son sitting at the long table in the kitchen of the Hawthorne Ranch, and she thought about arithmetic, the arithmetic of loss, the way she'd been carrying it, the way she'd taught herself to pre-count every good thing and find the cost in it before it found her. She thought about a man who had built a table for 10 and waited without knowing what he was waiting for. She thought about what it might mean to stop subtracting. Thomas came downstairs and sat beside Evan and stole a piece of his toast with the automatic ease of a brother who has never once believed he needs to ask permission, and Evan swatted at him without looking up, and Thomas ate the toast with total satisfaction. Sophie appeared in her nightgown, sketchbook already under her arm, and climbed into her chair and opened to a new page and began drawing something immediately before she'd eaten a single thing, the way she always did. "Sophie," Eliza said, "breakfast first." "In a minute?" "Now." Sophie sighed with her whole body and set the sketchbook aside and reached for her fork with the air of someone interrupted in the middle of something genuinely more important. Eliza looked at her 4 children arranged around that long table. 4 children. All 4. Always all 4. She thought about what Caleb had said. "Just as mine. If that's all right with you." She thought about the word 5. She thought about empty chairs and what it meant to fill them, and how she had spent 3 years believing that the presence of her children in any space was the reason the space eventually closed around them, when maybe the truth was that they had simply been moving toward the right space all along. Not because the world had decided to be kind, but because this particular space, this house, this table, this man who built it all bigger than he needed and kept it that way for 10 years without being able to say exactly why. Maybe this space had been the right size for them all along. She wasn't going to make it a philosophy. She wasn't going to let it become something she held up to the light and examined until she found the flaw in it. She was just going to sit here in this kitchen and eat her breakfast and listen to her children argue about toast and let the morning be what it was. Through the window, she could see the barn door open. She could see the thin line of Danny's small figure moving next to Caleb's taller one, carrying something, helping with something, talking the way Danny always talked, without stopping, without checking whether anyone was listening, just offering his words to the air and trusting they'd land somewhere. Caleb glanced down at him and said something she couldn't hear. Danny laughed. The sound reached her faintly through the glass, muffled by the winter air in the distance, but there. She pressed her hand flat against the warmth of her coffee mug and looked at the snow in the barn and her youngest son's small shoulders shaking with laughter, and she felt the thing she'd been so careful about, so defended against, move through her like water finding the level it was always looking for. Not hope. She'd had hope before and watched it fail. Something quieter than hope. Something that didn't need to announce itself. Something that felt, for the first time in 3 years, like it might actually hold. Winter broke slowly, the way Montana winters always did. Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, just a gradual loosening, like a fist unclenching finger by finger. By March, the worst of it was past. By April, the north field was showing green at the edges, and the horses were restless in the corral, and Danny had mud on every pair of boots he owned simultaneously, which Eliza had stopped trying to understand. Things had shifted between her and Caleb after that December morning in the kitchen. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but the carefulness she'd been wearing like a second coat had come off, layer by layer, without her making a decision about it. She stopped bracing for the conversation that would change everything. She stopped calculating the distance between what she felt and what was safe to feel. She let herself be present in the house, really present, not just managing it, and found that presence was both simpler and harder than she'd expected. Simpler because it required less performance. harder because it required her to be seen. Caleb was not a man who pushed. He had made himself clear that December morning and then stepped back and let her find her own way toward it, which was either the most patient thing anyone had ever done for her or the most respectful, and she thought probably it was both. He didn't corner her with feelings or demand responses she wasn't ready to give. He just kept being exactly who he was. Steady, present, quietly attentive in the way of a man who notices everything and mentions almost nothing. And let that be enough. It was, it turned out, more than enough. The proposal happened in early April, which was not romantic in any conventional sense of the word. They were in the barn. She was helping him splint a fence rail that had come down in the last thaw, holding one end while he drove the nail, and he said, without looking up from what he was doing, "I'd like to marry you, Eliza, if you're willing." She held the rail steady. She said, "You're asking me in the barn. I'm asking you where I had the thought." He drove another nail. "I could wait and ask somewhere more suitable, if you'd prefer." She thought about it genuinely for a moment. "No," she said. "This is fine." He looked up then. "Yes?" she said, before he could ask again. "I'm willing." He held her eyes for a moment. Something in his face did what it did when he was feeling something he didn't have immediate words for. Went very still, very present, like all of him was attending to the one thing. Then he nodded. He went back to the rail. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They finished the fence rail. It was not the proposal she might have imagined at 20 if she'd been the kind of girl who imagined proposals. But she was 30 years old and had buried a husband and raised 4 children across 3 states, and had learned, the hard way, that the value of a thing had almost nothing to do with how it was packaged. The value was in the man who drove the nail straight and asked her plainly and didn't dress it up in language it didn't need. She went inside and told the children at supper. The response was varied, as responses among 4 children tend to be. Sophie put both fists on the table and said, "I knew it," with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. Danny said, "Does that mean he's our dad now?" And the directness of it made the table go briefly, startlingly quiet. Eliza opened her mouth. She wasn't sure what to say. Caleb said calmly, "That's up to each of you." He looked at Danny specifically. "Nobody has to call me anything they're not comfortable with." Danny appeared to consider this for approximately 1 second. "Okay," he said. "Dad," and went back to eating his supper, as if that were that, which, for Danny, it apparently was. Thomas looked at his plate. He was 10 now, careful and observant as ever, and he processed things on a longer timeline than his younger brother. He didn't say anything that evening. But later, when Eliza was washing up, he came and stood beside her and picked up a dish and dried it without being asked, which was not a thing Thomas did voluntarily, and said, "He's not going to change his mind." She looked at him. "No," she said. "He's not." Thomas dried another dish. "I know," he said, which told her he'd known it longer than tonight, had been watching the evidence accumulate and building toward a conclusion with his characteristic deliberate care. He set the dish in the cupboard. "Good," he said, and walked away. Evan said nothing at supper and nothing afterward, and Eliza lay awake that night listening for his footsteps, some old fear flickering. But in the morning he was in the barn before sunrise, working beside Caleb the way he'd been doing for months, and when she watched them from the kitchen window, she saw Caleb say something and Evan laugh. A real laugh, not the managed, careful thing he'd offered people for 3 years. And she thought, that's enough. That's the answer. They married in May, in Millfield, at the courthouse. With a small gathering of people, Eliza had gradually stopped being afraid to know. Hector and Pete were there, the Ridley family from the neighboring property, who had warmed to Eliza over the winter in the gradual way of people who take their time deciding what they think and then commit fully. A woman named Ruth Calloway from town, who had started as an acquaintance and become, carefully, something closer to a friend, the first real friend Eliza had made since Iowa. Cordelia Hames was not there. Nobody mentioned this. Sophie wore a ribbon in her hair that she'd picked out herself and drew 12 pages of sketches commemorating the event, including what she informed Eliza was a portrait of how happy you look, which she insisted on showing everyone in the room. Eliza did not look at it until later, when she was alone, and then she looked at it for a long time. A small girl's rendering of her mother's face, rough and direct and slightly asymmetrical, but unmistakably, undeniably happy. She kept it. She kept it for the rest of her life. The ceremony was not long. The judge was efficient, the words were brief, and when it was done, Caleb took her hand and held it, and she let herself hold his back. And that was the whole of it. No performance, no pageantry. Just two people who had each been broken by different things standing in a courthouse in Montana and deciding, with clear eyes and no illusions, to build something together. Hector cried. He did it quietly and denied it immediately, and everyone had the decency to pretend they hadn't seen. What followed was not a fairy tale. Eliza would have been suspicious of a fairy tale, and Caleb had no interest in performing one. What followed was a life, with all the texture and friction and occasional genuine mess that lives contain. There were hard months. There was a summer drought that dried up the creek feeding the north pasture and cost them 24 head of cattle and required them to make choices that neither of them liked. Caleb was grim and quiet through those weeks in a way that reminded Eliza of a closed door, and she had to remind herself, had to actively hold the reminder in her hands like a physical thing, that a man being troubled was not the same as a man pulling away. She left him alone when he needed it and stood beside him when he'd come back to himself, and there were a few nights where he came in late and sat at the kitchen table and she sat across from him, and they talked about it, plainly, without pretending it wasn't bad, and that plainness was its own kind of intimacy. There was a winter when Danny broke his arm falling from the corral fence, and the bone didn't set right the first time and had to be reset, which was one of the worst afternoons of Eliza's life. She held Danny's hand through it and kept her voice even and then went out to the barn afterward and sat in the hay for 20 minutes doing the opposite. Caleb found her. He didn't say anything useful because there wasn't anything useful to say. He just sat down beside her in the hay and stayed there until she was done. Thomas, at 12, developed a talent for argument that he deployed with such relentless precision that Eliza sometimes found herself losing debates with her own son about the correct way to do things she had been doing for 30 years. Caleb found this privately hilarious, which he communicated to Eliza through a quality of expression she was learning to read, and Eliza found that she didn't entirely mind losing to Thomas when Caleb was watching with that look, which was a feeling she hadn't expected to have at 31, but was not going to quarrel with. Sophie kept drawing. She drew everything and everyone, constantly, prolifically, covering paper at a rate that kept Caleb making regular trips to the supply store in Millfield. By the time she was 8, she had filled 11 sketchbooks. By the time she was 10, people in Millfield started asking if she'd do their portraits, and she did, with the seriousness of a small professional, and came home with money she'd earned herself and laid it on the kitchen table and looked at it with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the amount. "You know you don't have to do that," Eliza told her. "You can draw just for yourself." "I know," Sophie said, "but I like that it means something to people." She picked up her pencil. "Papa says that's the best reason to get good at something, when it helps someone else." Eliza looked at her daughter. "He said that?" "Yesterday, when I asked why he takes such good care of the horses, even the ones nobody sees." Sophie was already drawing again, her attention half gone to the page. "He said you do the thing right because of what it means to you, not because of who's watching." Eliza stood in her kitchen and thought about a man who had maintained a house for 10 years, kept a table polished and long, looked after things no one else could see, and she thought, yes, that sounds exactly right. Tit. Evan turned 15 in the February after the wedding. He was taller than Thomas now, which Thomas managed with minimal grace, and he had taken on a quiet authority around the ranch that was not assigned to him but had accumulated naturally, the way authority does when it's earned rather than claimed. He knew the land. He knew the animals. He knew, increasingly, the financial and practical workings of the operation in the way of a boy who has been paying attention since the first day and storing everything. He still didn't talk much. That hadn't changed. But the silence had changed quality. It was no longer the compressed, armored silence of someone holding themselves apart from the world. It was just the quietness of a person who thought before he spoke and didn't feel the need to fill air for its own sake. He and Caleb had developed a working relationship that Eliza observed from a careful distance because she understood it was theirs and not hers to involve herself in. They moved well together on the ranch, the way people move well together when they've developed an understanding that doesn't need constant verbal maintenance. Caleb trusted Evan's judgment. He said so directly, which Evan received with the slightly stunned look of someone who has been handed something they weren't sure they'd get. There was an afternoon in Evan's 15th spring when Caleb put him in charge of overseeing the fence repair on the south boundary. A full day's job, requiring coordination with Hector and Pete and some decision-making about materials. He just handed Evan the responsibility, no qualifications, no looking over his shoulder. Evan came home at supper looking tired and capable, in the particular way of someone who has done something real. "How'd it go?" Caleb said, passing the bread. "We got it done," Evan said. "Hector thought we should double the posts at the corner where the ground's soft. I agreed with him. We used the extra timber from the stack behind the barn." Caleb nodded. "Good call." Evan took the bread. He didn't say anything else, but something in his posture had shifted. Some internal arrangement of himself had settled into a new configuration, and Eliza saw it and felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. It happened gradually, the way the most important things happen. So gradually that you couldn't name the moment, only look back later and see that somewhere along the way, it had become true. At some point, without announcement or ceremony, Evan started calling Caleb Dad. Not because anyone asked him to, not even consciously at first. It slipped out one morning when he was asking about the horses, and he stopped, and for a moment the kitchen held its breath, and Caleb looked up from his coffee and said, "Yeah?" in the same tone he'd have used for any question, and Evan said what he'd been going to say, and that was the whole of it. After that, it wasn't a slip. It was just what it was. Eliza heard it the first time and went still at the stove and stayed still until the moment had passed, and then let it be what it was. She didn't mark it. She didn't make it into an event. She understood that making it into an event would be the wrong thing, that the rightness of it depended partly on it not being made into something larger than itself. But she held it. Quietly, privately, she held it. The following spring, she told Caleb she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, early morning, before anyone else was up. She wasn't afraid, which surprised her. She had expected fear, the fear of more, the fear of need, the fear of what it would cost. What she felt instead was something more complicated and less manageable. She felt like someone standing at a window looking out at more land than she'd known how to want. Caleb set his coffee mug down. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "How do you feel?" "Surprised," she said. "Happy." She paused. "Scared." "Which part scares you?" "All of it," she said honestly. "The usual parts. What if something—" She stopped. She'd lost a child before, between Thomas and Danny, early, quiet. A grief she'd carried alone because James had been so destroyed by it, that she'd had to hold his grief alongside her own. She hadn't told Caleb about that. Not yet. "I've had a hard pregnancy before," she said. "I know it doesn't always—" "I know," he said. "I know it doesn't always." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, plain and steady. "We'll be careful. We'll get you to the doctor in Billings when it's time. Billings is 3 days. Then we'll go to Billings." She looked at his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. "There are going to be 5 children in this house," she said. Something moved across his face, that private, attending stillness. "Yes," he said, "there are." "You built the table big," she said. "But—" "I'll build it bigger," he said. She looked at him. He said it so straightforwardly, so without drama, as if the question of whether there was room had already been settled long ago, and they were simply now filling in the details. She thought about a table built for a family that never came. She thought about the particular faith it took to maintain something like that for 10 years, to keep the chairs polished and the wood oiled and the space intact without knowing if anyone would ever sit there. She thought about what that said about the kind of person Caleb Ashford was. Not a man who gave up on the shape of things just because the specific people hadn't arrived yet. She thought about herself at 27, sitting in a boarding house room in Iowa with 4 children and $17, telling herself that wanting things was something she'd used up. She thought about the road between those two women, the one who had driven up to a stranger's porch with her children and her walls, and her rehearsed speech about why he should say no, and the one sitting here now, in this kitchen, in this life. And she thought about what that road had actually required. It hadn't required her to stop being afraid. She'd been afraid the whole time. She'd just stopped letting the fear make the decisions. That, she thought, was the whole of it. Not bravery in the storybook sense, not the absence of doubt or difficulty, or the very real chance of getting it wrong. Just the decision to keep moving toward the thing that felt true, even when every learned instinct said to pull back. Just the stubborn, undramatic insistence on not letting the worst things that had happened to her be the last word about what she was allowed to have. She squeezed Caleb's hand. "We'll need more chairs," she said. "I'll make them," he said. Muskan. The baby came in November, on a night when the first real snow of the season was falling and the ranch was buttoned up and warm. They named him James Robert Ashford. James for her first husband, because that was right, because history deserved its honoring, and Robert for Caleb's father, because that was right too. Because a name could hold more than one thing. Because a family could contain its full history and still be moving forward. The children's responses were, again, varied. Danny held the baby with the deep seriousness of a child who has been handed a significant responsibility and intends to rise to it, and announced immediately that he would teach James everything about horses as soon as James was capable of learning, which he estimated at about 6 months. Sophie drew 12 portraits of the baby in the first week, none of which looked very much like him because newborns are difficult subjects, but all of which captured some essential quality of smallness and newness that made Eliza press her lips together when she looked at them. Thomas held the baby once, briefly, with the careful arms of someone who is not yet sure what to do with very small humans, and said, "He's got your nose," to Eliza, which was both observationally accurate and emotionally the closest Thomas got to declaring that he thought this was a good development. Evan held James on the second day, sitting in the rocking chair in the corner, Margaret's rocking chair, which Sophie had claimed as her drawing chair, and which had, over the years, become simply the chair where children sat. And he held him with the ease of the oldest child in a large family, the natural competence of someone who has been handling younger people for years. He looked down at the baby for a long time. Then he said, to Caleb, who was standing nearby, "He's got your hands." Caleb looked at James's small, curled fists. "You think so?" "Yeah." Evan looked up. There was something in his face that was old and new at the same time, some complicated mixture of the boy who had sat in the snow with frost on his eyelashes and the young man who ran the south fence line and made good calls about soft ground and timber. "He's going to have a lot of people looking out for him," Evan said. "He doesn't know how lucky he is." Caleb looked at Evan for a moment. "Neither did you," he said quietly. "At first." Evan held his eyes. "No," he said. "I didn't." A pause. The fire in the stove, the snow at the windows, the small sounds of a baby breathing in someone's arms. "I do now," Evan said. Caleb put his hand briefly on the back of Evan's neck. A hand on the neck, brief and solid, the kind of contact that doesn't need language, and then moved past him to put more wood on the fire. And Evan looked back down at his baby brother, and the moment passed the way real moments do, without ceremony, already becoming part of the ordinary texture of the days. Caleb built the longer table in the spring. He did it himself over several weeks, in the barn on evenings after the work was done. Eliza could hear the sound of it from the kitchen sometimes. The saw, the plane, the particular rhythm of a man doing something careful with his hands. He didn't talk about it while he was building it. He just built it. The morning he brought it in, he needed Evan and Hector and Pete to help carry it, which involved a significant amount of maneuvering through the kitchen door and one genuinely tense moment with the door frame, and a collection of commentary from the children that ranged from helpful to the opposite. When it was in and the old table had been moved to the barn, where it would serve as a workbench, practical to the end, Caleb stood back and looked at the new one. It was long, longer than the first. It filled the kitchen the way the kitchen had always been waiting to be filled. "How many does it seat?" Thomas asked, with the assessment of someone running numbers. 12, Caleb said, comfortably. We're only 8, Thomas said. Yes, Caleb said. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his coffee mug and went to check on the horses. Thomas stood there looking at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Eliza. She looked at the extra chairs, the ones that weren't yet filled, the ones that might be someday by grandchildren or by neighbors in from the cold, or by people none of them had met yet, or simply by the general overflow of a life that had gotten larger than anyone had originally planned for. She thought about what it meant to set a table for more people than you currently had, to leave the chairs, to keep the space. She had spent 3 years of her life making herself smaller, pulling her children close, taking up as little room as possible in the world because the world had repeatedly suggested that the room she required was too much. And then she had driven up a dirt road in October and stood on a porch and met a man who had spent 10 years doing the opposite, making more room, keeping more space, trusting that it would eventually be needed. They had, she thought, balanced each other. Her caution and his faith. His steadiness and her hard-won knowledge of exactly how things could fall apart. Neither of them had the whole picture alone. Neither of them was the finished version of themselves without the other. That was not a comfortable thought, exactly. She didn't particularly like the idea that she'd been incomplete, but she'd gotten old enough and honest enough to know the difference between dependence and the genuine thing, the thing where two people make each other more themselves rather than less. She and Caleb were the second kind. She was more herself in this kitchen than she had been in years, maybe more than she'd ever been. She set the table for supper. She set 8 places, because that was who they were today. 8 people, improbable and mismatched and entirely real. Hector and Pete, who had become, without anyone deciding it, part of the permanent arrangement of the household. Sophie, who would be 9 in the fall, and who had already quietly decided she was going to be an artist, which Eliza had stopped arguing with. Thomas, who was going to argue his way into something significant someday, she was almost certain. Danny, who loved horses and this ranch and his new baby brother with the same uncomplicated total commitment he brought to everything. Evan, who was 15 and capable and quiet, and who called Caleb Dad like it had always been true. James, who was 6 months old and had not yet developed opinions about the table, but would. And the two of them, herself and Caleb, who had found each other on the far end of loss and built something here that was not perfect and not uncomplicated and was theirs completely. She put the last fork down. She looked at the table, the full length of it, all 12 places, the 8 that were filled and the 4 that were waiting. She thought about the woman she'd been, on that porch, in that boarding house, in all those places between Iowa and here, saying I come with 4 children like it was an apology, like the people she loved most were the reason for her diminishment. And she thought about what she knew now, with the clarity that only comes from having lived something rather than just survived it. They were not the reason she'd been turned away. They were the reason she'd kept going. They were the reason she'd had the stubbornness to keep driving up strange roads looking for something worth stopping for. They were not her burden. They were her compass. They had always been pointing here, to this table, to this man, to this life that was loud and cold in winter and demanding in ways she hadn't fully anticipated and fuller than she had known how to want. She had not found this life in spite of her children. She had found it because of them, because of who she'd had to become in order to take care of them, because of the specific kind of person that 3 years of difficult roads had made her. Someone who couldn't be fooled, who couldn't be managed, who knew the difference between performed kindness and the real thing the moment she encountered it. They had made her someone worth loving. She hadn't known that. She knew it now. From down the hall, she heard James begin to fuss, and then heard Danny's voice. He had appointed himself assistant baby manager and took the role with complete seriousness, talking to the baby in the patient, explanatory tone he used for explaining things to creatures that couldn't yet understand him, which was the same tone he used with the horses. She heard Caleb's footsteps coming in from outside, the back door, the thud of boots on the mat, the particular sounds of a man coming home. He came into the kitchen and looked at the table and then at her, and something in his face settled in the way it did when he came home to a house that was full of the people he'd made his. "Supper almost ready?" he asked. 10 minutes, she said. He nodded. He poured his coffee. He sat down at the head of that long table and looked at the length of it. The set places, the waiting chairs, the whole improbable expanse of it, and the expression on his face was one she'd seen before. The first time had been the night Evan came home from the cold, and they'd all sat in this kitchen letting the fear drain out of them. She hadn't had a word for it then. She had a word for it now. Content. Not happy in the bright temporary way. Content in the deep structural way, the way a well-built thing is content to bear the weight it was made for. He looked up and found her watching him. She didn't look away. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He held her eyes for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did, and he looked back at his coffee. Outside, the Montana spring was doing what it always did, opening up, expanding, making more room than the winter had suggested was possible. The north field was green all the way to the tree line. The horses were moving in the corral with the loosened energy of animals no longer managing cold. Inside, one by one, the sounds of her family filled the house. Danny's voice, James's small protests, Sophie's footsteps down the hall. Thomas already asking Evan something, probably about something practical and slightly contentious. The whole living weight of 6 people moving through the rooms of a house that had been built for exactly this. Eliza turned back to the stove. She finished making supper. She called them all to the table, and every chair was filled.